Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric Reviewed podcast. We're here for episode 7 of week 2, and we're going to be discussing today, does tolerance kill a society's foundations? So I'm actually excited to share this with you because this is something I've come up with recently, and I'm very proud to actually call it my own sort of novel theory. So we're going to begin with the introduction, and finally, at the very end, we're going to end with the final conclusion you could take away, so make sure you stick around until the end, or at least skip ahead to section 5. So introducing the idea of standards. So what is a standard? A standard is something that a society or a person takes as a given and what is right without any question. So it's something that is inherent in a system or society that dictates how people act. So what's important about a standard is not only does it create the society that it tries to enforce. For example, in America, our freedom of speech and democracy is one of the standards that we hold ourselves to. The very the very standards help reinforce the society itself. So a society based on freedom and democracy is going to use freedom and democracy to keep itself as powerful and as stable for as long as possible. So that would be, for example, having the freedom to point out when politicians are being corrupt. So that's one example of standard enforcing itself. So, something important to realize about is that standards, especially when you go to more like religious or philosophical things, aren't born in a vacuum. Very few times can standards actually be born of something completely new. They're always created in the context of what has been and what will be around them, or what is around them. And this would be, and of course, there needs to be a starting point, but deciding these starting points is very difficult because there's always a context around which a standard is based. So, for example, a place a standard might have been born might be the birth of Christ, or at least when he began disseminating his teachings, because he was bringing more or less something novel to uh, the world stage. So again, standards define society, and society enforces its own standards by virtue of what the standards themselves supply, whether that be, um, you know, loyalty or whatever it may be. Standards are important for defining a society, and societies always must define their own standards by use of the standards that originally made them happen. So that might be hard to get, but let's go over the concept of standardization. So standardization is not related exactly to what we just discussed, but more to the uniformity of society as time progresses. So a lot of people, especially historians, have discovered that there's about 4 different stages where society has progressed and has standardized. You might think agricultural is one, right? Agriculturalism, because not every society might choose the same type of agriculture or plants, but every society eventually turned towards the concept of agriculture. So standardization doesn't always have to be something that where everyone's exactly the same, but it might just be that the standards are changing or some more overarching idea is changing. So on my screen, my everything's frozen. I don't know what that's about. Um, and we're back. So everything was frozen for a second. But I just want to say it again, that standardization doesn't always have to be one single uniformity. Not everyone needs to be the same, but as long as everyone's held to a similar standard or everyone has similar expectations, kind of like how different societies choose different ways to approach agriculture, right? You have like the steppe farms in the Andes, you have massive pastures, you have all these different ways to approach it, but ultimately the connecting line is that agriculture was the main theme back in the pre-industrial age. So let's go over it in the industrial world. If you want to go learn more about this, I've already recommended it a few times, but *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind* by Yuval Noah Harari is a great book when it comes to discovering and exploring some of these ideas that I'll mention here. So standardization in the Industrial Revolution basically came down to the fact that people needed to be conforming to a certain standard in education and practice as to make the industrial system possible. For example, if you wanted to work in a factory like the one you see on screen here, or if you're not viewing and you're listening, any factory with millions and maybe or thousands and hundreds of similar machines, then have to be standardized and not unique, but the same as every other individual who works with the same machine you have. And to achieve this, education masterminds and people at the very top of power decided that we need to make things more equal in society and therefore more standardized. So the same people who pushed for standardized public education are the same people who pushed for women's rights because that expanded the labor force. So that's a very interesting part of history that I think it goes unexplored, and maybe there's a whole video to be discussed about that. But ultimately, what it came down to the fact is that the economic demands for labor during the Industrial Revolution caused mass standardization in culture and society in general as an outgrowth of the way education and consumer goods was approached. This is because once you start mass producing stuff standardized, right? If you start mass producing radios, for example, or maybe quilts, people who purchase those quilts are going to be the same in the way they interact with that quilt. So there's less individuality, or at least less tribalism, when it comes to the way you interact with consumer goods. And that's because of standardization of not only labor, but of outputs or goods. So this obviously conflicts with, we hear a lot nowadays that individualism is too high, that we don't have enough attachment to family, religion. But this is besides the point, because as we said earlier, individualism, if everyone is an individual, or individualistic, which is different from being an individual, of course, if everyone is individualistic, that itself is a standard that you should be individualistic. So despite there being the argument that everyone's more individualistic now, which leads to more atomization and more disconnect, and you're losing personal autonomy, that applies to in the workplace, but outside, everyone still sort of lives as an individual. Of course, they're impacted by other things, but the connecting dot between all of these things that we're all living as individualistic people. So that leads into the idea of tolerance. So all of this is set up and contextualizing the main point in this video, which is what is the idea of tolerance and how does that possibly kill a society's base foundations or standards. So first I want to re-emphasize how important foundations are to a society. So foundations would either include, in this case, it's a more broad term than standards, but either founding mythology, a assumed traits or action that people think, or definition that is assumed by the people, or alternatively, it could be a certain document or religion. For example, you would have in theocratic states the holy book of that holy book, or maybe a priest leading that society, and that is the foundation, the beliefs or ideals carried by that thing or book or person. Alternatively, in the United States, we have the Constitution, which enshrines a certain amount of different rules, regulations, but also the rights of the people, and that serves as our foundations. More socially, this will come later in a contemporary examples piece, but this could also include the very existence and importance of the acknowledgement of religion as important, or it could be marriage between men and women being assumed as the normal foundation. So foundations is a very wide term. It can be applied to a lot of different things, and a lot of things are indeed foundational ideas, and we'll get into this later when we go into depth of foundations, but a lot of these are also subject to change. So tolerance is essentially accepting outside groups without friction, but also there's a clear line between tolerance and positive acceptance. So positive acceptance is when you're encouraging a group to flourish within your own community that is an outside group, or you're trying to encourage a new idea. None of this is necessarily good or bad, or you're trying to encourage a good idea, and that would be positive acceptance. So tolerance is notably the first step to get to positive acceptance. This is when you don't mind. It's more of passive dismissal rather than active encouragement, because you're not looking for this group to assimilate necessarily, but you're okay with their presence, if that makes sense. And this is tolerance when it comes to group, but it also comes down to, but it also applies to ideas. How receptive are you to new ideas, and how do you let these ideas flourish? Obviously, we work in the American free market of ideas, in addition to the free market of companies or the market. But historically, the trend has been that America itself is the new idea, right? People were not particularly receptive, even the great philosophers of past times, of democracy, or at least republican virtues, until around the 16th, 15th century, 17th century, when that idea became popular and that replaced the status quo. So if you zoom out, you can't treat this sort of tolerance of new ideas, or you can't treat American free speech as the norm. In history, that was not the norm, and we're simply thinking that because that is the foundation of our society itself. For example, we believe equality is good because that is a foundation of our society. It's not a, a given necessarily. And obviously, if you come from a Christian moralistic standpoint, yes, it is a given that equality is good. However, if you don't come from that school of thought, at least, you don't give that, you need to have the wherewithal to realize that doesn't apply to everyone, every society, and not everyone thinks that way. Given that, tolerance is an interesting topic because to accept an outside group is antithetical to human psychology or sociology, where we've been shown to be multiple times over history extremely tribal. And what that contributes is it's hard to accept outside groups, and it's hard to actually incorporate them, or at least be passive dismissal. If you go back in history, at least, you're gonna find that tribal warfare, whether it's from humans versus Neanderthals or within human groups, has been rampant. And even today, you can see that the way people ascribe themselves to ideologies, or oh, I'm a Democrat, oh, I'm a Republican, all of these things, it shows that we're naturally tribal to different groups at once. That kind of makes up the identity of individuals in today's world. And that's the idea of tolerance. And the danger in tolerance, as we'll get into in a second, is when it becomes active encouragement. And this doesn't apply to everything. Obviously, some ideas are amazing, some people are amazing and should be accepted, but when you begin to lose grips on what to take in and what you let influence your society, and that's when things start falling apart. So let's go to the death of foundations. So when can positive acceptance, or the active encouragement thing, begin to degrade foundations? So again, foundations are important because they let society do what it's made to do while adhering to what standards it has. So fundamentals allow societies to maintain a clear vision of what they should be doing, which allows them to be productive, and which allows things that people before them have, enshrined as necessary to be necessary. Things evolve, of course, and this is a cycle fundamentally, but this is something I've thought about and came up as indeed it is a cycle throughout multiple things. The only problem is that sometimes the cycle might not actually happen, and you end up with void. So this is using Latin a little bit, but Thesis Fundamentorum, the thesis of fundamentals. So this is the standards we are talking about. Thesis Fundamentorum encompasses all of the standards, the fundamentals of a society. This encompasses X, Y, Z. It encompasses, what's good, what's bad, what should be encouraged, what should families do, what do families look like, how do we go about society, all of these fundamentals that are a given in society. Or it might be like a founding document kind of thing, like the Constitution. And for the Constitution, if you didn't know, was it basically based on the Federalist Papers, which was written by some of the founding fathers, including Madison, and this is the founding document for the United States, and this serves as the fundamental. So notably, in the past, at least for the early American history, what existed was a group called the Anti-Federalists. So I looked into them a lot. I've been looking into them a lot, but this Anti-Federalist group was obviously, Anti-Federalist is a word designated to the Anti-Federalists by the Federalists, to make them look bad. But ultimately, that's what it was about. They were people who were against the Federalist Papers, or at least had some reservations about how the Constitution should be made and how it should be taken. So one of the biggest ones back in that time was the Bill of Rights. They were concerned that the Constitution would end up with like an aristocracy, at least according to the Sentinel essays, which you can look into, Sentinels. But ultimately, the Bill of Rights was made, compromises reached. So what's interesting about this isn't the fact that they were, had these opinions, but the fact that their name, Anti-Federalists. So without Federalists, they're just anti. They're actually, no, anti is just a prefix. They're nothing. But that's the point. Antithesis Fundamentorum is the antithesis of fundamentals. These are the people opposing, or at least challenging, the pre-existing worldviews. And in history, these would be for example, the anti-federalists. These could be the humanists who denied some of the preconceived notions, but not all of the preconceived notions of religion. This could be Darwin, who, wasn't none of. I would say Darwin's a bit more of Thesis Fundamentorum, because he actually, like, Darwinism was a more leap. But ultimately, this he could still be described as Antithesis Fundamentorum, which is challenging the preconceived notions of society that which was creationism, where God created the animals and humans and Earth. And what this serves to do is it's a challenge. It's a useful challenge. No matter what it is, it's always a useful challenge. Challenge is good because it allows for growth, right? But what this ends up is, depending on the way this is undertaken, for example, the Anti-Federalists were mostly successful. The cycle ended at Antithesis Fundamentorum, and the Thesis Fundamentorum changed. Or you can, I guess, look at it as going through the whole system. But what often happens is that fundamentals fall. Exodus Fundamentorum. So exodus means fall, decline, or death in Latin. And what this is saying is that once the antithesis takes over the thesis, the fundamentorum, or the fundamentals, disappears. It dies out, or at least declines, right? Because the antithesis has done such a good job at refuting or fixing the thesis, or the original foundation, that eventually you're left with the decline. And then you have nova fundamenta, or fundamentorum, which is lack of foundation. No foundation. I guess that would be better translation Latin-wise. No foundation. This means that in that specific purview, for instant, there is no foundation. There exists no distinction between X, Y, and Z and A. And for a brief second there, in the process of changing back into Thesis Fundamentorum, you have nothingness. You don't have a standard. You don't have a foundation. Importantly, you always get back to Thesis Fundamentorum, where in that nothingness, what the antithesis has criticized by the thesis becomes anew, and a new idea is amended. So this is a cycle which basically shows that you have these fundamentals, you have people opposing those fundamentals, then the fundamentals either degrade, or maybe it stays the same. Then you have a period of nothingness until it comes back again, anew, with a new thesis for it to be challenged again. So what's interesting about this is that some processes have especially long nova fundamentorum. And this lengthy time is where people and society itself decides whether or not they actually like the lack of the original thesis, whether or not they can survive without the original thesis, or whether or not they should adopt something else. And because, as I said earlier, anti-federalism is based on there existing a thing called federalism, it cannot exist in a vacuum. So antithetical ideas don't exist in a vacuum. So when antithetical ideas disappear, or when antithetical ideas make the thesis disappear, they cease to exist. And that just extends this nova fundamenta. And that goes into some of the contemporary examples where I can actually illustrate this process this undergoing process. So just to summarize this cycle, you start with the thesis, which is the initial fundamental or standards of the society. You have people who directly go against that for the purpose, the antithesis, which is the opposite, who go against something that already exists. And then, depending on the outcome of that movement, the fundamentals change, or they decline. And during this time, there exists a period where there exists no fundamentals because you're still deciding whether or not you want to apply the antithesis. But during this process, the antithesis disappears and becomes a new thesis. But in this process, this process takes longer the more considering it to do, because you have to completely overhaul a system. And the fundamentals themselves might be lacking for time. So that goes into contemporary examples. I'll first go through morality and religion. So religion is the original thesis, because as we said in Sapiens, religion is inherent in the human condition and has been inherent since the beginning of human consciousness because of its ability to bring people together and its inherent psychological evolutionary benefits. So that's thesis. Antithesis would be secularism. Secularism can only exist because religion existed before. It's inherent in the movement is anti-religion. Right, you might say, it's a whole new world view where you just, look for nature and stuff. But no, secularism only exists as a word because it's not a given that the world is secular. However, it is a given that the world is religious, and that's what history tells us from the very beginning. So right now religion is declining. I believe we're somewhere in between Exodus and Nova. But as religion declines, we enter this Nova Fundamenta period where we're not sure what to decide. Do we like secularism? Do we like religion, or I don't know, anti-secularism? Whatever the word is. Do we like theism? Do we like anti-theism? Or right? And during this time, we are undergoing some serious psychological, sociological hurdles. Religion's dropping, which might have a direct impact on the way people interact with themselves, their lives, how they regulate themselves, families, birth rates, all of these things which have, religiosity is important to the human condition, and therefore when we lack it, there are consequences, and we're seeing that today being played out as the church and local religious communities, or mosques, whatever, have less and less authority over their community because people aren't as reliant on them, which it should be, because it's been proven that smaller societies and smaller groups and communities, excuse me, function better than mass federal government trying to decide things from on high. And we're losing that right now as a partial consequence of the antithesis that is humanism or secularism, which says a no to traditional religious fundamentals. And that's important because, do we want to lose this? What are we going to decide in Nova Fundamenta? This is where we decide what we want. And we're already seeing a little bit of a turn back into, in certain groups, back into religion or the original thesis. But it's also equally apparent that a lot of groups are choosing to follow the antithesis's contrarian views into founding a new thesis, which is born from the antithesis. So we might be moving more secular. The other more interesting example I have is with marriage. So thesis, or initially, has historically been in almost all but a few societies that it's straight marriage, right? Men and women, and the desire is to procreate and leave stable societies where you have at least a two-parent household, or at least a community where you have multiple families that are able to work together to raise children, right? We always hear that saying, it takes a village. And that gave a rose to its antithesis. If you have straight marriage, you have what's the opposite of straight? Not wavy, but you would have gay or homosexual marriages, right? Same-sex marriages. And so what this does is it directly challenges the notion, not of the utility of gay marriage, like, that's tolerance. Tolerating gay marriage is one thing. But by trying to push it onto the original fundamental, by trying to change the fundamental, by going past tolerance, you're serving as an antithesis. And we've already entered Nova Fundamenta, or we're in the process of entering. But by breaking the fundamentals, by challenging certain fundamentals like this one, you end up in Nova Fundamenta for a long, long time, where there exists no actual definition. So, for example, if traditionally marriage is between men and women, and you also want it to be between men and men, then what's the foundation of marriage? Right? You get rid of these foundations that let these institutions and ideas exist, and during that time, while you figure it out, certain ideas have a greater impact than others on society. So, and by getting rid of the initial definition of, for example, straight marriage allows for gay marriage to be antithesis to it. But by perverting or changing so seriously the definition of marriage, you can't have an initial thesis for the antithesis to exist. So this is kind of where it all comes together. By getting rid of the fundamentals that an antithesis is based on, you actually end up getting rid of the antithesis itself, because the antithesis cannot exist in a vacuum. It can't exist without the existence of a thesis. Gay marriage cannot the term gay marriage cannot exist without the existence of straight marriage or marriage itself, because you're making a distinction by saying the words gay marriage, both marriage and gay, right, or homosexual or straight. So you need certain fundamentals to stay the same for the antithesis to be viable, and that's the takeaway. Some things don't need to go past tolerance. By changing the definition of marriage, you get rid of both the concepts of straight and gay marriage, or polygamy and monogamy. By changing the fundamentals of certain things to deeply ingrained things, you leave for greater disaster in the wake. Because once marriage is not as impactful, we're already seeing the disastrous social consequences, mass divorce rates, a lot of single homes, more kids out of wedlock, all these things, because marriage is declining as public perception. It's not so much of a, you know, holy matrimony, at least in Christian terms, as it is a practice or a cultural practice. And that's having serious consequences on society, because here's the thing, like, you might say, oh, people only leave marriages because they're unhappy, but that's not the original purpose. If you look back at, for example, the way religion used to be, even if you were unhappy, your duty was to the marriage as a unit. The marriage is a concept more than just a legal term or legal status. And that's the distinction. You might even want to say, the recent gender issues, male and female, or gender roles, I guess, would be more accurate, where, right, I think I agree, most people agree that, if there are to be more effeminate men or masculine women, that should be okay and tolerated. But once you start to change the definition of the base gender roles, you lose point of the antithesis itself. If there are no gender roles, you can't have a group who is advocating for certain gender roles to be removed or at least changed, or that, crossing between the two is possible. So in certain cases, as a leader of the group of thought, you shouldn't be prioritizing a, aggressive or active encouragement. You should be going for passive tolerance or passive dismissal. And that's the case because you need to be able to survive, and you need your ideology to win. And to do that, often you're going to lose your ideology itself by trying to attack the foundations of what makes your ideology even possible. So to make it as simple as possible, I'm not very sure. This is even for me, it's sometimes I lose sight of how this is possible, but the existence of a thesis allows for the antithesis, which is based on there being a thesis, because you can't refute nothing. But in certain issues where the foundation of the thesis is so ingrained in society, by getting rid of it, you not only cause harm to society, but also harm to your own ideology, because at that point, your ideology can no longer exist. I think the best example of this would be the marriage example, whatever it may be, polygamous, monogamous, or homosexual, heterosexual. By degrading or at least challenging the fundamental notion of marriage, you're essentially devaluing your own point, because if you want marriage for homosexuals, for example, to matter as much as straight people, it doesn't matter if marriage doesn't mean anything at all after you finish what you're doing. So maybe it's better that you stay out, for example, in that case, you stay out of the issue of changing the fundamentals, and you seek passive tolerance rather than active encouragement. So this was definitely a harder thing for me to actually visualize. It's ultimately comes down to the fact that certain ideas can't exist in a vacuum, and some ideas and antitheses, whatever, some antithesis ideas lead to the degradation of foundations, which leads to the degradation of themselves. And tolerance is the first step to achieving passive dismissal. And it's important that some ideologies don't go into active encouragement, because it degrades their own purpose. It doesn't let them get what they want. But that's all I have for you today. This is a bit of a more convoluted video because it's a harder idea for me to even get out of my head. But if you have any comments, criticisms, questions, concerns, or you want to discuss anything further I said in this video, please leave a comment. It's been the Rhetoric Reviewed, out.